Oh, I think I got it. I think we got it.
Okay.
I think we got it.
All right. I'm gonna go pull it up now.
When dark clouds have gathered and sadness and despair draw near, I'll charm with a smile and tell you what you want to hear. That I have been trusting in God to supply what I need. And now my pants are on fire, and that's the list of my misdeeds. Yeah, all my self-pity is not looking pretty, and even though I really can't sing, boy, I wish I was praising and my voice was raising the song of eternal hope, that in the face of chaos I'll choose joy.
think that would probably help the problem now, wouldn't it? Yep, there we go. All right. This is what I feared. This is just technical difficulties that we're gonna make this a little bit more tricky than I had hoped, but hopefully everybody will be able to hear me now. So I'll wait for them to tell me if they can or not, but I'll just get started with what I wanted to say. Yeah, thank you guys so much for being here to listen to my album. It is not happening here. It's so surreal in this moment where we're all getting to hear it for the first time, and I'm so grateful for everybody's support. For those of you who have followed me since my first initial attempts at making music, to those of you who may just be listening for the first time themselves, I just want to thank you all and say that your love and support truly means the world to me. So I felt it necessary to take this time to explain a little bit about what you all are going to hear in a few minutes. Those of you who may not know me well, I think you're going to find yourself a little surprised at what I have to say in this album. Those of you who do know me well, I think you're also going to find yourself surprised, not at what I'm saying per se, but the ways in which I'm saying it. And I'm hopeful that within the context of the album, everything will make sense. But that's also why I'm going to come back here on YouTube after the whole listening party is over to answer any and all questions that you may have about the songs. So a little bit more about kind of what this is. Like, in short, this album is something that I believe that God has helped me to create to speak to this current political moment in time, as well as to everyone who would claim to follow Christ, who lives in America. I'm not claiming that this is like some sort of American gospel or anything, but kind of the opposite. I want everybody to understand that I believe the evangelical church in America, quite frankly, has gotten a lot of things wrong. And this has led to, in my mind, a creation of this horrible beast of a religion that celebrates vague concepts of, faith and freedom and family values, and kind of puts God not above these things as they should be, but kind of like on equal footing, so that he has to compete with all of these other idols for our affection and love. And then I think there's a lot of, so-called Christians who think that because we believe in these things, freedom and faith and family values, or that because we vote a certain way, that this is proof of our identity in Christ. And, there may be some of you right now who think, this couldn't be you, or think that I'm being, too bold to even suggest that there's a problem with, holding to these ideals. But, I'm someone who believes that there's going to be a lot of so-called Christians on the day when Jesus comes who thought they were practicing their faith right, but they're going to be sadly mistaken. And I don't say this to as an act of condemnation, but just as an earnest plea that you and I, myself included, don't end up being some of these believers by God's grace. So, and, to those of you out there who aren't believers, for whatever reason in Christ, I want you to know, too, that I wrote a lot of these songs with you in mind. If you want absolutely nothing to do with any Christian or evangelical church in America right now, I honestly can't blame you. The majority of evangelical church, will champion political and cultural leaders who are at best morally questionable and at worst downright despicable in their character, but they think it's okay to vote for them because they hold to Christian values and protect the sanctity of the family, things like that. And that sickens me. And it's sick. I'm sure it sickens a lot of you also out there to see people supporting now unspeakable acts of terror and exploitation, both on our streets and abroad, proclaiming the name of God in America to all the nations. And certainly the last couple weeks, in my mind, is proof positive of how that's manifesting in the world right now. And so I really feel like I am hopeful that whatever I can do as an artist, is just to help shake some of these believers out of their stupor, or just help encourage people out there that, I'm someone like you who feels that a lot of what the church is preaching right now is wrong. That's all there is to it. And I hope and pray, in spite of this, that I can still show and demonstrate through my music, the beauty and joy and love that comes from truly knowing Christ and experiencing the forgiveness and grace that allows me as a sinner to do good in others' lives. It's because of my love in Christ and, what he represents that I feel compelled to say the things that I do in these songs. It's not out of a moral superiority, Lord knows. I'm just as sinful and undeserving of God's grace as any unbeliever would be. And, people who claim to believe in Jesus and don't show it in their lives, I'm still just as undeserving of grace as they are, but I know his power is such that he can forgive and embolden his true disciples to carry out his will for the good of the world and for the good of those who still have yet to call on him as their savior. And I believe that my role in that right now is to call attention to many of the ways in which, those of us who believe in him are getting a lot of things wrong. So, there are a lot of critiques of contemporary evangelical Christianity on this album, but also songs too that incorporate a lot of socio-political critiques as well. I think those of you who know me well know that I've tended to stay away from diving into political waters, for a long time. And I suppose it's a little ironic that in one breath I am here, criticizing how the American church gets so enmeshed with socio-political issues, and yet this album has songs that deal with that, those issues and religious issues side by side. But after praying a lot about this, and I've ultimately decided to include a lot of these same critiques on the album because the church has become inseparable from socio-political issues. If you critique anything in the church, you're already in sort of waters where you're wading into political territory almost. That's how I believe ingrained this is here. And a lot of these issues that I'm talking about in these songs are issues that also affect the church. The issues with problems with modern masculinity, problems with how we treat foreigners in our land, problems with toxic internet discourse. These are all things that can affect the church too. And that's why I've not just decided to make this album about critiques of the church, but just about society as a whole in some ways. So to that point, I want everybody to understand as well that as an artist, it's the part of the part of artistic freedom to write songs under the guise of a persona or a character that I've created in my mind that represents and holds to a particular value system that I myself would vehemently disagree with. And I hope it's clear that in the context of some of these songs that you can tell where I'm actually speaking from my own viewpoint versus where I'm clearly talking from somebody else's, viewpoint that I've created, and that you're not just thinking, oh my gosh, Eric's a racist, or Eric's a misogynist. You hear what he said in this song? Hopefully I've done my job as an artist to help you all understand where I'm clearly speaking from a different point of view, so that it gets across that this is clearly something I don't agree with. Another point that I need to get across, there's a lot of songs on here that use a lot of strong language, and some of you may argue that some of the things I say are inappropriate to talk about or reference for someone who claims to be a Christian. If you end up feeling like this, or if you feel like this is a stumbling block for you, I'm sorry. I want all of you to understand I'm not strictly aiming to be, offensive or edgy on here. Nor am I'm trying not to be gratuitous with the language I'm using. Everything that's on here has a purpose. There's a reason why it's there. And my wife can attest to this as well. I've spent multiple days in the crafting of this album praying and fasting about what I needed to write and, about what I had then eventually written. And many times I found myself asking, Lord, is this really what you want me to say? This seems to be crossing some sort of line that it would make a lot of people uncomfortable. But I felt the Lord's peace about everything I've said on here, regardless of its, offensive nature, because I think the Lord is leading me in my own walk to understand that the truth of what's going on here in America, and especially in the evangelical church, is heavily offensive to him. And I would rather, now risk being offensive, kind of by, as an artist, holding up a mirror to what's going on in our current socio-political or, church culture right now and reflecting what's actually there than just trying to paint over it with, bland, inoffensive worship songs. Like, that's not who I am as an artist. That's not what God has called me to by doing this and by giving me the ability to write the music that I have. So just wanted to throw that out there. You may not agree with what I have to say, but, if you disagree with the way I'm saying it, that's maybe something I can learn from, but I also think at this point in time, I will stand behind everything I've said and know that there's a good reason why I've said it. Now, a couple things about what this album is not, and I want to make this very clear too. This is not an attack on religion or Christianity itself. I hope through these songs it's evident. I have, by God's grace, a great love and affection for Christ and the church, and the anger and the fury that will come through these songs is not directed at Christianity as a whole. It's through the myriad of ways that its core beliefs just get so twisted for evil, and at the people in America who are very adept at taking the words of Scripture and turning them into propaganda for whatever political movement or you want to name. I want to make that as clear as I can, that this is not a tirade against Christianity as a whole. This is about specifically, the evangelical church and how, we in America have gotten things so twisted. And, so that those who may accuse me of speaking out against Christianity as a whole, that's not the case. And this is not, and I want to make this abundantly clear too, this is not an attack on the church I grew up in, nor is it against the church I currently belong to now. By God's grace, I was raised in a church that was faithful in preaching the word of God and the gospel of Christ for all the years that I belonged to it. And it was, filled with people who lived out their faith with diligence and dependence on Christ for all things. And the same is true for the church I belong to now. It's filled with people who earnestly desire to love Christ and love others. And, that's reflected in the great community of believers that I'm blessed to be a part of. Now, it's not to say these are, perfect churches or anything. I'm sure both of them would attest to that. And I'm sure there's many in them now who are, watching this or listening to what I have to say who would disagree with a lot of what I have to say. And I'm sure I would disagree with others too about various political or social points in the churches. But those disagreements are inevitable in an imperfect world. And I just want to make clear, I'm so thankful to God for the churches I grew up in, the church I'm a part of now, for their faithful preaching, teaching of the gospel, and the community of support. And it's because of that I'm writing the album that I did, and trying to speak God's truth and proclaim it, because of the training I've received from these churches. I see what happens in some of these other places, or I have friends tell me what has gone on in their church growing up, or that goes on in somewhere else, near where I live, and it's sickening. And I'm so blessed to not have been a part of that, but the part of me that hurts for those other Christians that have gone through a lot of other issues like that, the fire is in me to write things that speak to that. So I just want to make that clear. This is not a tirade against the church as a whole, nor the churches I've been blessed to be a part of. My hope for this album, first and foremost, is that the gospel is proclaimed through it. I hope it reflects the truth of Christ's power, his grace, his mercy, and highlights how, historically over the 250 years of America, independence and all that, the church has gotten so much wrong and has led us so astray in a lot of ways. So I hope that this album speaks to you wherever you are in life and encourages you, that that there's many Christians like me out there who are sick with the direction the church has gone, and that, it would encourage you, whether you're a musician, an artist, a preacher, anything else with a platform for the gospel or for talents that God has given you, that you would join me in, being able to speak out boldly for the sake of Christ, and that others who don't know him now would see that there's plenty of reasons to be frustrated with the church, and there's people who want to do something about it, but it also is that I want to encourage people to know just how wonderful Christ is as well, and that's the ultimate purpose behind doing an album like this. Now I also hope that, for the sake of just I've talked a lot about what's content wise within the album, but musically speaking, I think this album rocks. I really have enjoyed putting this together. It's taken a lot of what I have learned as, a 5-year-old listening to, my parents' music collection, and just from the rock all the way up to now where I'm at, in terms of my musical direction. And I think it's some of my best work to date, musically, lyrically, performance-wise. I know and I'll shout him out here. My dad listened to the first single and he was like, I don't know about this, sorry Dad, I hate to put you on blast like that, but I think in terms of what I wanted to set out to do musically, I achieved it. So, and I'm super thankful to the other contributors on this album. We've got, Hannah, Tim, and Ben. Your vocal performances were awesome. Christian, for your absolutely amazingly graceful piano playing. You helped add to the power of this album. And I thank, again, all you, friends and family who have, helped support and promote this album. That means the absolute world to me. And I thank you, who are listening now, ask if that, if you do appreciate what I've done here in terms of the music, consider supporting it just by sharing it, on social media, telling your friends about it, and continuing to listen, because that's really what I hope from this, is that people can just listen to what God has placed on my heart, and that what I'm, for lack of a better word, preaching to you right now. it's not, I'm not in this for the fame or the notoriety. I'm not in this for, the money aspect. That's never, I don't want that to be my goal as an artist. I want simply that the name of Christ is continuing to be proclaimed through the nations, and that my art, however it can be used by God to help change hearts and lives, and that's really the bulk of it there. So, yeah, I think I've droned on for long enough here. So it's about that time where we're gonna gather together over on Bandcamp, and I will put the link in the chat on YouTube here. So let me pull that up real quick, and then we'll do that. Let me see here. Yeah, I know there's been a lot of people who are like, yeah, where do I have to go? What do I have to do? But I'll try to make this as clear as I can for you guys. Yeah, here's the link for the Bandcamp. So I'm going to post this in the YouTube live stream chat now. And then, there we go. Copy that. And then I'll come back here. Yeah, again, I apologize. I'm not very tech savvy, hopefully, as you all can tell. There we go. So there we go. Now I've posted that in the chat. That's where we're going to go, and that's going to start right at 8:30. The Bandcamp will have that started, and and then at 8:30, it's just going to run through the songs, and then after that, we'll come back on YouTube, and I'll kind of answer whatever questions you guys may have about what I've said, about what's happening on this album. So if you're wanting to think of questions to ask me, good questions, I would definitely appreciate that. And yeah, I think that's all I've got to say. So again, thank you guys so much. This means the world to me. Everybody's support. And I hope you guys enjoy. And if rock's not your bag, if you're not a big fan of heavy music, then you may not enjoy. And that I can't really fix. But content-wise, if there's things you disagree with, if there's things you want to challenge me on, I invite that. I want you to reach out to me, text me, message me, whatever you can do to say, like, hey, listen, Eric, I think you're right about X, Y, and Z, but I don't think you should have said this or that. Let me know, because I want there to be an open dialogue between myself as an artist versus what other people perceive my art to be, and that I'm making sure that I'm always reflecting Christ in all of that. So that is, I think, again, all I have to say. I'm going to stop it here for now. I'll leave the live stream up just with the kind of a picture of the URL of where to go for Bandcamp, but that's all I've got to say, and hope you guys enjoy. All right, everybody, here we are. That was the album, and yeah, that was so fun. I am so happy it turned out the way it did. And just hearing the comments just from some of you, like on text, and just with some of my friends in the other room, it was so fun. And I hope you all enjoyed it. Now's the time where if there are any burning questions about any of the songs, that you can feel free to put them in the chat, or you can feel free to text me anything you've got that you want answers about. I'm sure there's a lot of things that you guys are like, oh wow, what does he mean here? And I will say first off the bat that I totally was going to put the Google Doc in the chat before we started the listening party with lyrics, and I didn't do that. But I put it in the chat during the first song. So if you guys want to reference that, if you're curious about what the heck I said, even if it wasn't quite clear, you could feel free to click that link. That'll take you to the Google Doc. As some of my friends pointed out, some of the lyrics aren't quite correct, but they are at least pretty close to what I was saying in those songs. So if you're curious about that, you can go ahead and look at that. A couple songs that actually, a couple of questions that I already have that I will feel inclined to answer at this point. Spirit of Calvin. It's not John Calvin. I did that intentionally because I know that would fool a number of you, who of course know my background in the Reformed Baptist Church. It's not John Calvin. That was not the intention. The reference is to a Methodist preacher from the 1800s named Calvin Fairbanks, who worked as an abolitionist in Kentucky. He was a Methodist preacher who, at some point, I believe in the 1850s, was still preaching, but by night was helping aid slaves over to free states. And I referenced this Lewis Hayden, who I believe was a very prominent African American lecturer and professor. He was the one who got him to freedom in Ohio, but then upon coming back, he was then arrested and then thrown into prison and was given a sentence of 15 years in the state penitentiary of Kentucky. But then he was freed by Lewis Hayden himself, who actually, once he had gained enough money, freed Calvin or paid his bail from the state penitentiary. And he was released, but was never, because of people were so mad that this guy was an abolitionist, he never really kind of regained a footing in the church and never kind of made a name for himself. So I referenced that too. How he died, kind of penniless, but, I would like to imagine that as a preacher and as a godly man, which by all accounts he was, that I've read into, that he is, enjoying the fruits of his labor, in the divine presence of God. So, that's what that song's about, at least. I've got another question here from one Joe, I believe. Yeah, Joe Caruso, yeah, something like that. Are you single? No, I'm not. As you can see, I've got the ring on here. Married to my lovely wife, Hannah, who's been an emotional rock throughout all of this. But I thank you, Joe, for your, support of me in that way. No, that was just a mess with him. No, he did ask. Now, in all seriousness, he did ask the same Spirit of Calvin song. Did he? What was the influence for that song? I have on my Spotify page a list of songs that were direct influences for this album. So I mean, in terms of like what's influenced me, like some of you will know I listened to basically everything, and clearly anything rock based on this album was gonna be an influence of mine for this. I believe that in that song in particular, the ones that I was pulling reference to, you have the song 4th of July by Soundgarden, which is a really good one. the song "Colony" by Joy Division. The bass line and one of the midsection was directly taken from that. And then you have this really little known David Bowie song called Black Country Rock. It was before he got really big. He was doing a bunch of really heavy art metal type of stuff, and that the guitar line from that, the that one was directly taken from that. So I should probably give him a writing credit on that song. Yeah, I should probably have done that before I posted this online. Yeah, but that's so Joe. Just for that question, that was yeah, those direct influences of that song. I don't know if you would have picked up on any of that or not, but that is that's the influence there. All right, question from Amanda here. We've got, let's see. My question is, what was the hardest part of writing this album? In terms of things you were afraid to say and unsure how people would take. Oh, gosh, good question. And what do you hope people take away? The hardest part was obviously, I think the lyrics were a struggle for me to feel like, I'll put it this way, like the musical stuff on here, that's the fun part for me. That's the easy part for me. That's not to say that I'm like, I'm not trying to toot my own horn per se, but that's the part that comes the most naturally to me. I'll say it like that. Lyrics and singing too, like, cause I don't like my voice. That's the honest truth about it. But I think it turned out pretty okay. But I think the thing that I struggle with the most is thinking that, are my lyrics worth what I think they are in terms of, what I've written? Do they make sense? Are they funny? Are they interesting? Do they really provide an opinion that is worth sharing? That's always been my struggle, is like, am I presenting a viewpoint that is worth its salt in terms of having you guys listen to it? So I think that's the hardest part for me there, is to feel like what I'm saying is, worth putting out there. And at that point where I felt comfortable, like, writing the things that I did, and and my wife also, like I'd mentioned before, she can attest to this, a lot of time spent praying, in prayer and fasting about the things that I wrote down, like trying to figure out, is this really what the Lord has for me? And that's, I'm not sure how everybody's going to take this. I'm sure, and I'm already seeing a bunch of nice notes in the chat from Abby and Becca and Joe, like, thank you guys so much. That is, I know you guys would appreciate that. I'm sure there's plenty of others who may listen later on, or even who listen now, who do not appreciate what I've said, and that's, there's only so much I can do. But what I would hope that you all take away from this is that I think the Lord is, for better or for worse, using me as just a vessel here. Like, I think prophet is too grand a word for what I'm doing here, but that there is a message on that God is using me to proclaim to everyone here, and that it is a message that he's certainly not happy with the way things are going in the church. Certainly in America, he's I think there are plenty of other nations, throughout biblical history that were stricken down for way less in terms of crimes than what America is guilty of. So I think that's important to remember as well. But I could go on with that, but I think the important takeaway is that, in spite of the problems with the church in America, which I do highlight, and problems with just American culture as a whole, and the ingrained nature of society and religion and Christianity that we have become sucked into, that he still loves the church as a whole, that he loves us as his believers and wants us to use, and not be afraid of, the political or, cultural ramifications, but just to speak out and try to, explain what it is that his word says about who he is and what he wants his people to be and what is going to come. Not what's we're supposed to build in this day and age, not what we're supposed to, try to convince the nations of Christ's power. It's not about that. It's about telling people about what is to come and how he wants those whom he has called to come to that realization. And I'm sure I could keep going on and on, but I feel like I've said enough. Yeah. Let's see. Other questions along those lines. I see a question here from Abby in the chat. This feels like an album that can't, or rather shouldn't, be put on shuffle. That's true. That's how I've kind of designed it. What do you want to say about the way the story of the idea of this album plays out? Abby, that's a really good question. I grant you, if you were just to take any of the songs from the album and just listen to them on your own, if you hadn't known what the heck I was talking about, you'd be pretty confused. But that's just the way I approach music. I have a litany of records on my shelf. I just love listening to albums as a whole. I'm not one who just likes to listen to just one song from any particular artist. I love listening to albums, and that's how I judge the worth of an artist. So that's why, for my own art, I want to make whole cohesive musical statements that flow together. There's no direct story on this album. It's not like this is a concept album in the sense of, there's a character that takes a narrative journey or all that. This is just, a series of, I guess, perspectives about sociopolitical things in America, about, relation to the church that, takes on a lot of different issues and tries to, reckon with them, or at least help people understand that certain things are more serious than they seem. And yeah, I grant that it probably would make a lot of sense if you hear one song out of context, and that's something that, I'm just going to have to be okay with. And I hope, I'm not saying that if you want to listen to this, you should just listen to the album and not any of the particular songs. Like, now that you've all heard it, I'm sure you could take each individual song and just enjoy it for what it is. But I'm sure for people who were just going to listen to a couple of songs and just be like, what the heck is he talking about here? I hope that at least answers the question you're asking there, Abby. Joe, once again, asks, I'd like to know some of the musical inspiration for the album. Again, Spotify playlist, the IINHH playlist, influences playlist. That's got all the stuff in there that I was listening to or basing a lot of the tracks off of that, led to the development of everything. Got a question from James. Are there any pastors or spiritual leaders besides Calvin that inspired you as you wrote these lyrics? That's a really good question. And it is interesting too, because there's a lot of some of the instrumental portions, like the intro, the interlude of the Beloved Wake Up, and a couple of the other longer instrumental portions of some of the other songs. I did write them with the idea of having specific pastors talk about some of the various things that I was referencing in my songs. Guys like Francis Chan, Paul Washer, and some of the pastors that I've grown up with in the church that I belong to, previously in the church that I go to now. And I'm not going to say their name live on stream here just because, you never know who's watching these things, and I don't want to, implicate anybody in anything that they're not prepared to defend. But there was a lot there that I took from them in terms of ideas. Ooh, another one too, not necessarily a pastor, but an author. Her name is Kristen Kobes Dumez. She wrote a book called Jesus and John Wayne, which, if you haven't read that book, is a really good, detailed account of how the church and masculinity and evangelical Christianity have all become this just behemoth of a concoction that is really quite dangerous in a lot of ways. And she really breaks down a lot of these societal issues that come with, how American Christianity has perceived, what the role of the husband as the head of the house and what that means, and the ways in which that has become problematic in the culture. So that all to say, she was also an influence for a lot of the content on this album. And I'm taking that, what they have said, and wanted to use that as inspiration, but I didn't include some of the clips that I had planned to on the album, just because, and I was given counsel by this too. If there was any reason why, and again, I'm not expecting this to go viral or anything. I'm not expecting a lot of people to really, push this to any notoriety or anything, but if that did happen and there were people who didn't like the album as a whole and wanted to implicate the other people who were involved in, in the clips or things that I'd planned to put on there, and wanted to say, oh, we don't agree with you because you said this on this person's album, and he's a socialist or whatever people might think about me. That I wanted to, at least just have my words stand for themselves. But I'm happy to. But that's why I wanted to answer that question in that way. That people like Francis Chan, Paul Washer, I think they have a lot of good stuff to say about where the church is at that is not in line with just mainstream evangelical Christianity. So, and certainly the church, and if you know me, and if you're know where I go to church and where I belonged to originally, then I would say definitely those pastors and those those people there are certainly in line with what I would agree with and think they do good stuff. Another one from Abby here. Redeem Land feels like a worship song at the end of an angry, convicting sermon. Was it difficult to put a period at the end of a thought that's still rapidly unfolding? Wow, that's another really good question. The title Redeem Land itself is taking that from the title of a Father John Misty song called Screamland that just came out last year. And in that song, he goes into a lot of detail about his church upbringing and, his views on spirituality. Now, he was certainly one who has said he grew up in a fundamentalist household, but since has rejected Christianity. And again, kind of going back to what I've said before, I can totally understand that given the environment that he grew up in, So just a little bit of background about why I called it Redeem Land, because it sounded very similar to Screamland, and that the Screamland was a very, if you listen to it, you can see where I took a lot of influence, because he definitely wrote that song to sound like a mainstream worship song, and that's kind of what I wanted to do, to put, like you said there, Abby, like a period at the end of a thought that's still rapidly unfolding. In terms of the, was it difficult? I think if I remember right, in terms of when I was writing this all, maybe back in the summer, fall time of last year of 2025, I think this was the one that I struggled with the most. Not because it was the toughest to write from a content perspective, but just because I wanted to make sure everything here, because I knew with the music I had for this, and that's a little more about how I tend to write as well, as I always write music first and then I'll put lyrics on top of it. So I had written the music. I knew this one was this is my favorite song on the album, just hands down. I know it's you're not supposed to have favorite children, but this one's definitely my favorite. It's just such a banger. So I wanted to make sure I got the words right, and I think for the most part I did. But it was a challenge to try to really get that correct in my mind, and I've had to pray a lot, and again fasting a lot about that. And I definitely think it's a pretty good summation of everything I talked about on the album, and I think it turned out, again, I'm not always convinced that my lyrics are the best. I don't think they are, but I think that one turned out pretty good. So at least that's the best I can say, probably, for the type of artist I am, who's always looking to get better and is always critiquing himself. Let me see. Okay, yeah. Also, another one from Abby about the boy next door and their process with bringing it to life. Yeah, that was the one that I kind of feared the most, because there's a lot of stuff on there that's, it's. So basically, going back to what I was saying about Kristen Demez's book, Jesus and John Wayne, that was directly the inspiration for a track like that. I wanted to write a song from the perspective of, somebody who, and I think a lot of, without saying that, straight white males suffer any sort of prejudice or at all, what's the word I'm looking for? just disenfranchised, I guess, in this country. That's that. I want. The point is, I wanted to take a context from a song, from the perspective of somebody who did think along those lines, and just try to see like how would he get to that point? How could he possibly think that was an idea? But there's a lot of easy reasons as to why. They're the online culture. People like Andrew Tate are, and this is why I said what I said about if this person having a sexual fantasy about him is because it's I believe that's how a lot of people perceive him. A lot of people who are in who feel like they've been disenfranchised by the government, or who feel like culture with too many DEI programs or whatever, feel like they're being left behind, turn to these right-wing influencers who just say, yeah, you need to man up. Women are meant to be servile. They're meant to be domesticized, and put ideas in people's head that you need to be this alpha male figure. And there's been I also referenced to the Supreme Gentleman. I don't know if a lot of you would understand that reference, but this was somebody who I think about 10 years ago did exactly what I said in the song, where he was harboring violent fantasies against women because he felt like basically the starting of incel culture, basically, if you know what that is. He felt rejected by women his whole life and wanted to seek his revenge because he felt like I'm a great guy, but all these women are totally it's so unfair. The culture has set them against me for whatever reason. Which is again, stupid way to look at it, but so, and then he did actually go and then kill a bunch of young girls in a college dorm room, and then I believe shot himself on the staircase. Now, I didn't want to have a song that ended quite like that, so I changed it to, he's running up the stairs to exact his revenge, and then all of a sudden slips and emasculates himself. I thought that was a very fitting ending, and I'll give credit to Hannah because she helped me come up with that. Because I was struggling. I was writing the song and I was struggling really to find an ending, and then I was gonna have him die in some weird fashion, and then I was trying to talk to Hannah about because she's the gun expert out of the two of us. Like what would happen if he was running up there with a gun, and she was like, well, he'd probably shoot his dick off or something like that. I was like, honey, that's it. That's perfect. And then that just fell into place. So, yeah, that was really, I thought, a really good capper on a song like that. So that made it feel like, yeah, this is somewhat, even if it's not exactly at all quoting scripture or anything like that, it almost made it feel sort of divinely ordained that, and that's something that I'm not saying that to say that at all should be taken as like a scriptural whatever. But that sort of artistic inspiration that whether you're a painter or a drawer or a musician like yourself, you're writing and then all of a sudden there's just something comes. It's like, oh my gosh, that's it. That's what I've been looking for. That's kind of how that all fell into place for me, and that's why I was like, I have to, regardless of whatever people might disagree with the content. That's how I knew. I'm like, I have to include this song on this album. I just have to, because it just seems so perfect for everything I was trying to do there. So, anyway, lot to say there about that one, but yeah. Another one from our friend Joe. What's your process for writing these songs? You start with the lyrics message, or you start with a melody? Yeah. The process is always changing, evolving over time. As I'm doing more of these albums, as I'm doing more of these songs. I think in remembering back beginning of last year when I was starting to get musical inspiration, I believe I started with the music first, which is not to say I started with a melody. Usually what happens is I'll just be noodling around, and you can see here I'm in my kind of spare bedroom here where I do have a lot of my instruments handy. I'll just be noodling around on the guitar or on the bass, or just playing a rhythm on the electronic drum kit that I have here. It'll usually start with that, some sort of idea that will then turn into probably like a chord progression or something like that. And then I start kind of putting different ideas together into the basic skeleton of a song. And then once I had that down for the bulk of probably those, maybe 8 out of the 10 songs were probably done by March of 2025. So this has been a long time coming for me. And then I think, okay, with the skeleton of the songs that I have, what would I want to address with each one of them? So then I start writing ideas down of like, okay, this one I think I could talk about, you know, the boy next door, some sort of toxic masculinity type of issue, or with God Bless the USA. Here's where I can address issues related to, American, Manifest Destiny. A song like, and so it goes, toxic online discourse, something like that, where I can kind of go skeleton by skeleton basically and start kind of putting, things together. And then after that point, that's when I will start composing a melody to then put lyrics to. That's kind of how that whole process has unfolded, at least for this album. And that's not to say I think in the future I might do it a little differently, but we'll see. But I think that's, for this album, that's how that all came together. So, an interesting question here from one Miss Hannah. I don't know why you're Miss Hannah. Anyway. Hi there, gun expert here. Where did you get the title of your album from? Very good question there, Miss Hannah. The book I was reading over the summer was a book called It Can't Happen Here by the author Sinclair Lewis. It's a dystopian novel set. It's kind of like, it's historical fiction basically. It was written in, I believe, 1932. No, I'm sorry, I think 1936 or 37, and it's meant to take place in 1939. And the premise of the book is it's similar to 1984, but it's important to note that It Can't Happen Here came before 1984 did. The premise of It Can't Happen Here is, a very, populist, shall we say, figure rises to power, because America is so entranced by his demeanor, by his very folksy kind of way of talking, and his policies are very much for America needs to go back to where we were when we first started. It's a very much a type of make America great again almost type of dialogue that he presents, and the bulk of the country ends up deciding to vote for someone like that. And the central character is a newspaper editor who kind of sees what's going to unfold if this guy gets elected, and the rest of the book is detailing kind of how he then goes about dealing with that, because once this guy does get elected, turns out, he's actually an authoritarian figure who completely takes control of the media. Certainly, I mean, if you read the book, you think, this could never happen this quickly, and that may be true, but you sort of wonder, like, okay, wow. You look at kind of what this guy was prophesying in the 30s and think, he did write this with inspiration looking at what was happening in Nazi Germany under the reign of Hitler, and in Italy with Mussolini, and he was kind of seeing the author was seeing what was happening in those countries and wanted to write a book thinking like, because people were saying, well, that could never happen in America. He wanted to write a book, be like, no, I think it definitely could. And that book, kind of was popular at the time, but then it kind of died down. It never got the notoriety of like a 1984 or a Brave New World dystopian, novel. But then, in 2016, people started picking that one back up again and were like, this seems very prescient. So anyway, reading that book again now, once 2024 election happened, I think was very instructive. And I decided to, once I kind of read that book, it was kind of like, you know what? I think this seems like a good way to reference this book as the album title, because it seems to speak to kind of what I'm fearing right now, which is that things in America are turning for the worse, and we're entering a very strange time. where, you know, without, I'm trying not to make too much of a political statement here, even though God knows I've already done that probably in a lot of different ways tonight. Um, but it's very, I think it was a very fitting way to say, the whole premise of the title, "It Can't Happen Here," is the author's way of saying, is the author's way of, through his characters in the book, you are saying, oh, well, nothing like that could happen here. It can't happen here. We can't have authoritarianism. Um, but I think for what I'm writing about in this album, it's sort of saying, by saying it is not happening here, it's sort of, you could take it whether it's politically, you could take it spiritually, you could take it any which way, where you have a lot of people who are saying, oh, there's nothing, it's not, what's happening here isn't wrong. It's not, authoritarianism isn't happening here, false prophets aren't happening here, we need to get back to traditional Christian values, that I feel like is, I think, why I wanted to make a kind of vague title like that. So yeah, that I kind of really probably answered that question to death. Even though somebody just asked, even though Hannah was just asking me about where to get the title of the album from, I hope that at least explains a little bit more about what that's supposed to mean. And I think also alternatively, you could take it like by me saying it is not happening here. Problems within the church, the rise of authoritarianism in this country. If that were to be happening, the idea of it is not happening here, that can only happen if we use our voice to speak up against things that are wrong. Using my artistry to write songs that critique a lot of what's happening, that's where we can truly get to a point where, hopefully what we're fearing won't happen here. Now, obviously, I would argue that if God is willing things to happen in this country that would seem counter to what we believe in, that's what's going to happen. So I'm not saying that to be like, and that's kind of the space I existed in for a long period of time, where I was trying to be a little more apolitical, because it's like, well, God's going to will what God's going to will. But it's like, no. God also commands us to speak up against prejudice, against idolatry, against a lot of things in the culture that are wrong. And some people, I think, take that a little too far when they say, we need to implement, Christian values into the fabric of the government or the fabric of political culture. I don't think that's what he means, but I think what he means when he says, when Jesus says, I'm going to butcher a Bible verse here, so maybe I should just stay away from that, but for right now. But I think the idea of what Jesus is calling us to do as believers is to, share the gospel clearly, which is that he is Christ and that he is the Messiah, and that his reign is not going to be one that is won by eliminating the culture. It is won by bringing light to what is going to happen when the new heavens and the new earth come. And we can, but he also, I think, wants us to, fight for, things that are happening in this culture where where there are injustices being done. And I think, that is something that I have previously been very wary of, but now I think I see is something that is more of a calling for a lot of Christians out there. So anyway, I'm getting to a point where I'm rambling a lot there, so I should probably just just stop while I'm ahead here. Another one from our great friend Abby here. Are there songs you wrote for this album that didn't make it? A great question. No, I don't think so, surprisingly. There are a litany of ideas that are existing on my computer that haven't been fully fleshed out yet. But I believe everything I did on this album was what was my initial thought for this album. I don't think there was anything I had on there that I eventually chopped off for lacking a certain quality or something like that. I will say the Trapped on the Highway song was something that I had previously was going to include on the Joy in the Face of Chaos album from last year, but I chopped that one off because I didn't think it truly fit the vibe of what I was going for there, which in retrospect was the right decision because it fit seamlessly into this one. Now, a lot of the other lyrical content on that song was rewritten and was, you know, the rap at the end obviously was not something that I intended to put on there initially, but kind of, again, artistic inspiration took over and I decided that that was going to be something I wanted to put on there. But that was, so that's to say there were things I had wanted to do on the last album that I saved for this one, and but there was not anything I chopped off to make room. I think everything came together the way it was meant to for this record. And I have other ideas of where I'm going to go next, and I think I saw Joe say at some point, like, oh, what's next? Yeah, that I believe. I'm hoping, my goal is maybe to try to write like a good batch of songs a year and, put them out at during the springtime or something like that, and potentially do more cover songs that I'll put out in the fall time each year. But I think it's going to be a lot softer than this rock album that I put out. I think it's going to be a little bit more singer-songwriter-y, a little more acoustic bass. Try to do more with the great vocal talent that I have in Hannah, Tim, and Ben. Do more with the amazing piano playing of Christian, and try to write more songs that would flatter their talents and incorporate them a little bit more, because they were phenomenal on this. And I just hearing their stuff that I put together, I'm always critiquing what I'm doing in terms of my singing and my playing, but when I hear them and what they've done, I think, oh, they give it so much life. So I'm intending to write an album that kind of does a little more for them than maybe this one did, I guess. And then our friend Tim asks, when you dropping a full rap album? yeah, that was probably a one-time thing that I did there. I don't think that's gonna, unless Tim, you can create some banging beats and be the Joey Valence to my Bray there. That would be something I might consider doing in the very long future, but I can promise you that full rap album's probably not happening anytime soon. Yeah, I think, unless anybody else has any really good questions, and not to say these haven't been really good questions, they have been, and I thank you guys so much for giving me a chance to explain more about this album, and hopefully this gives a little more context to what I was trying to do here. Yeah, if nobody else has anything, then I think now, wow, we're already at 2 hours basically, which is kind of what I was hoping for. So I think this would probably be a good time for me to sign off and just revel in the fame, the notoriety that's gonna come from me. Just be praying and thanking God for just enabling me to do this, and just reflecting on how it all came together. And yeah, is there a question you hoped to be asked? No, I think you guys covered it. I was hoping you'd ask about influences. I was hoping you guys would want to know more about how some of the songs came together. And yeah, if you've got any more questions for me, you know my line's open, and feel free to ask away, because this is not just something that'll be for tonight. This will hopefully last for a little while. And like I said too, the best way that I think you guys can support what I'm doing here is just to keep listening. If you really liked it, keep making it a part of your daily rotation, or listen to it constantly. That would mean the world to me if I knew there were still people that didn't just listen to it once and then just shoved it away. That you keep listening, that if you really feel compelled, share it with your friends, your family, if you think they'd appreciate what I have to say. If not, then maybe don't worry about that. But I'm not looking to be in this to change careers. I'm not looking to be in this to make money. This is just for me to exercise my artistic abilities for the glory of God, and I hope I've done that well to His glory for this album. And I pray that this would, whoever has ears to hear and whoever needs to hear what I have to say will hear it, and that and that from here on out that I continue to work on stuff that will also make you guys you think about issues within Christianity within the church. I'm not saying that the next album is necessarily going to be along the same lines politically, but certainly elements of that will probably continue to crop up in my art because that's just something I feel passionate about. But that I can continue to get you guys to listen to stuff that is from a Christian perspective, but that isn't just bland worship songs. That songs with a lot of humor, a lot of heart, a lot of great music. That I hope I can just keep doing that in these songs. So just keep supporting, just keep listening, keep doing all that, and I would be very appreciative. So yeah, anyway, I think that's enough for tonight. I had planned to do another one on Sunday at 6 o'clock for maybe those who couldn't make it tonight. I don't know if there's going to be a market for that at this point. I don't know if there's anyone who needs to hear this again, but if there are people who said, oh, I couldn't make it, but maybe I can come to the one on Sunday, then maybe I'll do it again, and then maybe you guys can come back and ask more questions. But yeah, thank you guys so much for listening. Yeah, praise God. To him be the glory forever and ever. And yeah, hope you guys have a good night. Hope you guys enjoyed. Talk to you guys soon. Peace.